Good evening and welcome to the Indiana University Cinema's virtual screening room. I'm Britany Friesner, the Cinema's Associate Director. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Jorgensen Guest Filmmaker program with writer and director Isabel Sandoval. We begin tonight's program by acknowledging that IU Cinema is built and operates on the ancestral lands of the indigenous people of the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Delaware, and the Shawnee nations. We are grateful to work on this land, and we implore you to reflect on the land from which you're watching from home tonight. We continue to miss seeing all of you in the physical space IU Cinema inhabits, but we're so happy and feel fortunate to be able to connect with you virtually. We want to offer our sincerest gratitude to the OVW Jorgensen Foundation for making Isabel's virtual visit possible through its generous endowment funding, with special thanks to Jane and Jay Jorgensen. We want to also thank our Movement Asian Pacific America programming partners, which include the Asian Culture Center and the Asian American Studies program. Finally, I would like to personally thank filmmaker Ash Mayfair for introducing me to Isabel's work last year when she visited as part of the Jorgensen program in September 2019. Since IU Cinema's opening in 2011, the Jorgensen Guest Filmmaker program has been a cornerstone of our programming, affording us the opportunity to host dozens of visionary filmmakers, ranging from international directors Werner Herzog, Claire Denis, and Abbas Kiarostami, to American independent icons, John Waters, Kelly Reichardt, and Ava DuVernay, and remarkable acting luminaries, Meryl Streep, Edward James Olmos, Glenn Close, and IU alumni Kevin Kline and Jonathan Banks. We're delighted to now include Isabel Sandoval amongst the extraordinary artists who have visited and presented their work to IU Cinema audiences. We're equally excited to have Isabel be a part of our annual Directed by Women celebration, a worldwide film viewing party each September, which was launched in 2015 by our founding social media specialist and blog editor, Barbara Ann O'Leary. Barbara will be joining us in October to moderate our Jorgensen program with filmmaker Chris Ray. The format for tonight's program will be an extended conversation between Isabel and Dr. Ellen Wu. I'll introduce Dr. Wu, who will introduce Isabel, and then we'll run a trailer for Isabel's newest film, Lingua Franca, which is currently streaming on Netflix and is distributed by Array, Ava DuVernay's distribution company. Following the trailer, Isabel will join Ellen on screen for their extended conversation. And about 45 minutes in, we'll begin answering questions from the audience. Once the conversation starts, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And now to introduce Ellen. Dr. Ellen Wu is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Asian American Studies program at IU Bloomington. She researches, teaches, and writes about race and immigration in American life. She is the author of The Color of Success, Asian Americans and the Origins of the Model Minority, which was published in 2014 by the Princeton University Press. You can find Ellen's commentaries and appearances on various platforms, including Goop, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, it's a long list, I need to catch my breath, NPR Code Switch, Bloomington's Limestone Post, True TV's Adam Ruins Everything, and the new PBS documentary, Asian Americans. Quite an impressive list. Finally, and certainly not least, Ellen loves and misses going to the movies. Ellen, over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Britany. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really excited tonight to get a chance to talk with Isabel Sandoval. So I want to tell you a little bit about Isabel. Isabel Sandoval is a New York-based Filipinx filmmaker and MacDowell Fellow in film. The Museum of Modern Art has cited her as a, quote, rarity among the young generation of Filipino filmmakers for her muted, serene aesthetic. She is the first transgender director to compete at the Venice and BFI London film festivals with the New York set trans immigrant drama, Lingua Franca. Her noir-inflected debut feature, Señorita, had its world premiere at the Locarno Film Festival. Señorita was followed by the Marcos-era nun drama, which I highly recommend, Apparition, considered a contemporary Philippine film classic. And Apparition won awards at the Deauville and Hawaii Film Festivals after premiering in Bulasan. So Isabel's three features, all of which are female-centric dramas of interiority and displacement, have screened at prestigious international film festivals. So she's got quite the CV. Her screenings include the Thessaloniki, Stockholm, Vancouver, AFI Fest, and Palm Springs. Her work has been supported by the Tribeca Film Institutes, the New York Film Academy, MoMA, Independent Filmmaker Project, and Frameline. In November 2019, she received the SF Film Westridge Foundation Screenwriting Grant for her new project, Baptism. Last spring, we were going to screen her newest film, Lingua Franca, for our annual Movement Asian Pacific America series at IU Cinema. Of course, we had the COVID shutdown and I was super bummed. But now I'm really, really psyched that she's joining us virtually. And actually it's great timing. It coincides with the Netflix release of Lingua Franca. And I do want to congratulate Isabel for having it picked up by Ava DuVernay's film distribution company, Array. Now, before we meet Isabel, let's roll the trailer for Lingua Franca to set the mood.
I will cover you with love when I next see you, with caresses, with ecstasy. It's good to see you, Baba.
It's good to see you, my darling. I finished this work for you.
You need help with that?
Okay. I'm sending this to my family back home.
If you want, I can drive you to the post office. If that's okay with your boyfriend.
He's not my boyfriend.
You're safe now. You're here with me.
You don't know what you're talking about. That man, I was paying him to marry me for a green card.
Gorgeous.
I need to tell you something.
It doesn't matter to me.
Gihangol ko sa imong paghikap. Kalukog na ako sa dilaang.
Welcome, Isabel.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi.
And I'm so incredibly honored to be here virtually this evening at Indiana University for the Jorgensen Guest Filmmaker Program.
Oh, the honor is all ours. So thank you for joining us. So first, I just want to ask, you know, it's 2020 COVID times. I would just want to ask how you and your loved ones are doing.
We're doing well. My mom, who's back home in the Philippines, just like in the movie, is doing quite well. She just had her birthday yesterday. I'm sad to not be there, but there with her in spirit. And I am actually currently in North Carolina. I've been here since June. I'm an introvert, so it suits me quite fine. I've been quite productive. I finished the script for my next feature during the last few months, and I'm currently working a script for a TV series.
Yeah. Wow, we can talk more about that in a bit if you can tell us. But I congratulate you. Writing is so difficult, so that's fantastic. I guess to kind of go on the COVID theme, what's it like debuting a film in the middle of a global pandemic?
Wow. I'm lucky in that Lingua Franca actually had its world premiere last September at the Venice Film Festival, and it's traveled quite a lot internationally, and I traveled with the film for about 6 months after it premiered. I went with it to South Korea, Poland, Germany, London, the Philippines, and until I was actually in Paris when COVID hit and France went on lockdown. The movie was supposed to open there theatrically March 18th, and France shut down on March 15th, so I had to fly back from Paris to here. But I'm very excited. It finally opened in French cinemas in July and did quite well. And I'm so glad that it's now streaming on Netflix in North America. I feel that ultimately a film like Lingua Franca is better experienced at home.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, it's like you're describing the debut. It's like hybrid, just like everything else seems to be hybrid these days. But I appreciate what you're saying. The film itself is so intimate that it does have, yes, this private feeling, right? That I think then can be kind of echoed in the home viewing experience. So, you know, I've got a million questions swirling around in my brain after watching both Apparition and Lingua Franca this week. And I thought, you know, basically the questions are about your personal story, about your creative process. And then actually what I'm really interested in, and I'd love to talk to you more about, is the sort of the social historical context of the Lingua Franca story. I teach Asian American studies, and that includes Filipino American studies. So, you know, this film sparks so many thoughts for me and feelings too. But why don't we start a bit with your personal story? I'm just very curious, like when people ask, you know, who are you? Where do you call home? And tell us a bit about your filmmaking journey. How is it that you became a filmmaker?
Certainly. So I was born and raised in Cebu, which is where Olivia's character was from in the Philippines. And I went to Catholic schools from kindergarten all the way to college. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm religious, although the Philippines is predominantly Catholic at 95% Catholics and, you know, in our population. I pursued a bachelor's degree in psychology. And after that, I worked for about a year in Manila in marketing, so brand management. And then I came to the US to pursue an MBA at NYU. And I specialize in marketing and media entertainment. But ever since I was a kid, I've always been a big cinephile, you know, and as I grew older, my taste evolved and became more sophisticated. I remember one of my earliest memories, I was 4 years old and my mom took me to this grand palace of a movie theater in downtown Cebu, like one that was constructed before the Second World War. And we watched, you know, pretty mindless comedies starring the Filipino Charlie Chaplin and his then 5-year-old son. And then I eventually graduated to Kurosawa, Mizoguchi, Fassbinder, Almodovar. And it wasn't part of the reason why I pursued an MBA and went to NYU was because I wanted to go to New York, where the capital of the American independent film scene was. And while at NYU, I actually interned for the international distribution departments of Focus Features. And then that's when I realized, you know, like, who am I kidding? I want to make films. So that's, you know, I decided to make a short, Senorita, which got programmed at Vancouver and Frameland, and I developed that a year later into my first feature film, which premiered at Locarno. And I did not go to film school. So, and it was a deliberate decision on my part because, yeah, I'm a pretty independent-minded person, and I feel that, and this is not to deter anyone who's trying to pursue, you know, film studies. For me, my path is, my film school was just exposing myself to as many different kinds of cinema and cinematic masters as I can get a hold of on, and learning the craft and storytelling as I'm making my own films, which have been valuable experience, you know, all three of them, all three features.
I love that. It's so amazing that you are self-taught in so many ways. So tell us a bit about that production process, that creative process for you. You know, I'd love to have a sense sort of start to finish? How do you begin? You know, I'm
Yes.
a historian, I'm a writer. I begin with a question usually, right? Or sometimes an interesting source. But I was curious, do you begin with a feeling, a character? And then when you get that idea, you know, how do you develop the script? And then, you know, you said you were in MBA, right? So then what about the finances, the budget, equipment, crew, and cast?
You know, the creative process is pretty enigmatic and fascinating. You know, I've always, you know, for the longest time, I thought of it as a active, deliberate, you know, act, which partly it is. But then, you know, I was listening to this podcast last year by Elizabeth Gilbert, and she was talking about how ideas and creativity is also something that comes to you, and it depends on how open you are to that one. I remember French auteur Jean Cocteau once said that directors tend to make the same movie over and over again over the course of their careers, in the sense that, you know, directors, especially when they're working on personal projects, tend to revisit the same themes, issues, perhaps unresolved conflicts, and just as they make more films, their, you know, technique becomes more masterful and sophisticated. They become more subtle, better storytellers. And for me, that theme that I find myself impelled towards when I'm writing are first, women with secrets. And that's why I feel like the noir genre is kind of my home genre if I were to pick one. And second, these are women who are disempowered or marginalized in a certain way, and who are forced to confront and make intensely personal choices within a fraught socio-political setting or milieu. And that's true to all of my features. I know that Senorita hasn't been shown during the series, but it's about a trans sex worker who leaves that profession behind in Manila and moves to the province to take care of the young son of a childhood friend of hers who has to go abroad to work. And she becomes embroiled in the local elections and wanting to help elect the good, non-corrupt candidate. But in the process, she gets drawn back to her life in the city. So it's, these are the themes that I'm drawn to. But I can definitely say that Lingua Franca is really my most personal film to date. Both Senorita and Apparition are purely, you know, like something that I just came up with from you know, in my imagination, probably from, you know, films that I've seen. Apparition, for instance, the movie that really inspired the premise of that happens to be Raise the Red Lantern by Tang Yimou, for instance. And Senorita was inspired by the movie Clute, directed by Clute by Alan Pakula. But it turns out to be a very different type of movie that's like equal parts Wong Kar-wai, Almodovar. And so Lingua Franca in that sense is my most personal because I allude to my own personal experience as a transgender Filipinx woman living in Trump's America. It's not autobiographical in that I'm not undocumented like Olivia is, but I started writing Lingua Franca about 2 years after I finished Apparition, and I was then undergoing my gender transition. And I was just experiencing so many changes personally that, you know, might seem small to other and insignificant to other people, but to me, they feel just almost cataclysmic and monumental. Not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically, how my relationships with other people have shifted, not just with friends, but with, say, cisgender men, and navigating that attraction. And so that's also when I was started writing Lingua Franca. And halfway through writing the script, that was when Trump got elected. And just like a lot of minorities at that time, and I, joke to my friends that I am a Gold Star minority because of all these intersections of identity. Not only am I a woman, I'm a trans woman of color who's an immigrant. So I was plunged in a kind of emotional and existential crisis during those first few months of Trump's presidency. I was feeling vulnerable and anxious and tense, especially about making a film like this. And Lingua Franca is actually a distillation of my emotional state during that period. And so that factors into the mood and atmosphere and the tone of the film. In terms of my creative process, I usually take a few months or up to a year to just get inspired. Meaning like there's a snippet of song that would trigger, an idea for a scene. I don't necessarily write them down there and then, but I go through a process in my mind where over that period of time, I'm editing ideas too, and building on them, improving them, changing them. And when I feel like I have a pretty robust outline for the narrative and maybe a good handful of scenes that are already formed in my mind, that's when I sit down and kind of type away the first draft. And I don't do any editing. I give myself maybe a week to plow through that first draft, because I know that I'm going to be spending subsequent drafts actually editing my ideas and editing the script. So yeah, and I know that some people do not necessarily expose themselves to other artistic stimuli like other films or music when they're in that zone of writing, but I actually seek out other art, not for inspiration, but also because I know, and having made 3 films so far, that I'm actually ultimately finding my own unique and distinctive voice as a filmmaker, and that I'm not just sort of plagiarizing certain stylistic flourishes or elements from the works of masters, but I'm able to really, as I'm appropriating them, if I do, get inspired by some of these ideas, I transmute them in a way that they become part of my idiosyncratic vision, and that they're simply a means to an end for creative expression for me. And in terms of the financing, in particular for Lingua Franca, I've been very, very fortunate. I know that for a filmmaker like myself, that's a minority, there are not a lot of opportunities in an industry like Hollywood. But that's the reason why I really sought out Filipino immigrant artists like myself who believed in my voice and my vision. And I was lucky to find that with both, Jet Tolentino, who's a Tony and Grammy award-winning Broadway producer, and my other Filipino producers, Carlo Vallejo and Darlene Malimas. Jet, actually, because of his background in Broadway, was able to put together the private equity funding for the most part for the film. So the budget was just a little under 500K. 70% of that was private equity. About 20% were grants, like from the institutions that were mentioned earlier. and like 5% was from crowdfunding, because we had, you know, friends and supporters who did not have 10K just lying around to buy a unit and invest in the film, but they did want to support the project, and that's how we set it up. Yeah.
I mean, that seems so special. I feel like crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, it's like these little love letters that everybody sends you. It's like a potluck, you know, and everybody kind of chips in, and you have a community, right? Now, I'm really glad you brought up voice and audience. So one question I have for you, you know, you talked about this idea that a filmmaker might make the same film over and over the course of their career. So in some ways that your 3 features so far are like siblings, yeah? But I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about, for those 3 different projects, how you've seen your voice evolve, or did you have a different kinds of audiences, same or different kinds of audiences imagined for those 3 films?
Yes. First, in terms of how my voice evolved, I feel like, you know, the more films that I'm making, I'm becoming more of a visual and a sensory type filmmaker. I noticed in my first feature, Senorita, it was very verbose. I was doing a lot of, you know, telling and not showing. It's very exposition heavy. And I also thought that the cinematography was poorly utilized in terms of its dramatic potential and how to, for instance, create or sustain a certain mood or atmosphere, and, you know, use the camera work for character development, for instance. And that's something that I corrected, so to speak, with my second feature, Apparition, which is quite remarkable in that it's a very, very quiet film as well, if compared to typical or the more conventional Filipino films that are being made. And I think what I'm noticing is becoming a, you know, stylistic signature for me is, you know, my interest in the contrast between a placid and tranquil image and dramatic tension, you know, roiling underneath. I feel like with my films, the stiller the camera is, the more static the frame, and the less dialogue there is happening in a scene. That usually means there is so much going on dramatically underneath the surface. So it's a charged and loaded, you know, silence. And like with Lingua Franca, for instance, or in Apparition, halfway through the film, there is a 10-minute stretch of scenes where there's no dialogue, one scene after the other, but there is some of the most intense scenes dramatically in the film. And in Lingua Franca, for instance, when they're slow dancing, it seems, you know, on the surface like just a regular slow dancing between lovers, but there is so much going on in Olivia at that moment. And yeah, I just like to revel in those seemingly quiet, innocuous moments where there's actually so much going on. It's very Chekhovian, I guess. But, and I think, what's that?
So that really comes through. Can I just jump in here for a second?
Yes, of course.
When you were talking, okay, so this is kind of like in the news right now, there's a lot of talk about gender reveals. But so I started thinking, like, in Lingua Franca, there are these gender reveals, right? And it's not just what happens, but what doesn't happen, you know? And it's exactly going back to what you're talking about, this placid visual image, but there's all this like emotional tension, right, underneath, or person to person conflict. So I was wondering about how could you talk a little bit more about how you you built that. So for me, you know, and I think you've talked about this with other interviewers, and I know you've been working hard on the publicity circuit, right? But for me, the reveal of what didn't happen was I kept expecting a physical sexual violence, right? And that means that doesn't happen in the way that I expected it to, right? And of course, then there are other reveals about Olivia's, you know, gender identity and her citizenship documentation status. So can you say a little bit about that? That building that tension and layering it with visual.
You know, that was intentional in that I'm setting up certain expectations and subverting them. Physical violence against trans women in intimate, you know, situations has become a lazy trope in films featuring transgender characters. And, you know, on paper, Lingua Franca sounds like a textbook social issue drama. It touches on immigration and, you know, the transgender experience. And because of that, certain people might expect a film that could be somewhat preachy or didactic or loud and also angry and agitated. But I wanted to make a film that was quiet and reined in and subdued and intimate to compel people to think about someone like Olivia and the themes that the film touches on more deeply and critically. And it's really about, and I think I did that because, or by telling the story that I wanted my own way that wasn't pandering to a cisgender or a mainstream audience. That's why some people some audience members might think that it's narratively sparse, you know, and somewhat inaccessible. But I think I had the audacity and perhaps the confidence to show and present the narrative and dramatic elements that I thought was essential. How I made the film feel intimate is also by sound design. Sound design really plays a crucial part in a film, like even for a city like New York, you know, where you're used to it being more diegetically noisy. By toning down the noise and by introducing voiceovers, especially in the opening and the closing montage, you know, where you see the film opens with a montage of scenes in Brighton Beach, you know, America, essentially, and then you hear the hushed voice of my character, Olivia, speaking in my native tongue, Cebuano. It already situates the film and the perspective of it as, okay, so this might seem like a New York drama, but it's different because I'm telling it in my own voice and in a way that's very subtly, it's almost voyeuristic, I feel. And also halfway through the film, right after the sex scene between Alex and Olivia, there's the long shot that starts out with an extreme wide shot of her on the subway platform, and the camera starts to close in, and you hear their conversation, their pillow talk, essentially. And I feel like that's one of the scenes that really create that particular mood of intimacy that I'm trying to create in the film.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm rambling.
Oh, no. It totally makes sense. You know, the intimacy, the private nature, you know, her emotional mental space, that so comes through in the visual, right? The tight apartment shots. And I thought this too, even the shots where you go in the streets, in public, on the subway platform, at the beach, they still feel very closed in to me. Like, you know, when you're following her down the street and she's nervous around the corner, it's dark, or like you're saying, or when they're at the end, close to the end, when they're strolling down the boardwalk, and you know, it's panned out and you see the boardwalk, but they're having, and it's like they're like on a date kind of, so yeah, the intimacy comes through in all those ways. And I will say this, I used to live in Jersey City, which is just outside New York City, actually in a Filipino neighborhood, and it was so loud there. So it's kind of refreshing to have a quiet, like a New York film that is not loud, you know, that's so unexpected. And actually, I was thinking more about New York as a character almost, you know, in the story. And I think that another part that's really unexpected is that when we think about New York City and immigration, I think what most people will think of is about like Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, right? And the sort of very cliche, almost like gateway to America kind of story. And I think you did such a nice job of playing with that almost like that trope, or that, you know, that cliche we have, and the way that you talk, you nod to the old immigration, right, which is the immigration at the turn of the 20th century from Eastern and Southern Europe, you know, with the Russian family or the Eastern European family. And then you have this new immigration from, and largely from Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'll just, you know, mention what jumped out at me, you know, I don't know if you know the book by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. It came out in 1906, but it's a muckraking story about meat packing, you know, and so I that really came to mind. But then there's that twist where they're like processing meat in a halal way, you know, and so that nods to the new immigration. I thought that was really terrific. But actually, can I pull in something here? So do you know the work of Carlos Bulasan?
Yes.
So okay.
America's Art, and I'll just tell you guys, we actually optioned the book.
Oh, yay, I'm so excited.
The Bulasan estate, and we're looking into developing
wow. Congratulations.
series. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll just say for the audience, right? So Carlos Bulasan is very famous, maybe the most famous Filipino-American writer, and he came to the United States from the Philippines in the 1930s. And he was a laborer like Filipino men were at that time, right? And he traveled up and down the West Coast doing all kinds of jobs. And he was also a labor organizer, a communist. And then in 1943, I think he published this memoir, America is in the Heart, which is this gorgeous sort of, it is a love letter to America, but it also chronicles the violence that these Filipino workers are facing. So what I really thought of Lingua Franca in dialogue with Bulasan, because, you know, Bulasan writes America in the Heart as a memoir, an autobiography, but really it's a composite portrait, kind of mashing up different experiences of people he knew, the laborers of the time, right? And in your story, Olivia reflects some of your experiences, but I think I read on Vulture or somewhere that you also talked about how you made it her character a composite of different friends and people, you know, their experiences. So I don't know, I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about, you know, and then the Bulasan story, we're talking about a cohort of males. And then here now, you know, since the 1960s, you know, in the United States, immigration from the Philippines has largely been women.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've also been very careful in that, you know, I don't want to present Lingua Franca as the representative work about, you know, the experience of Filipina trans women immigrants in the US, but I did want it to capture and chronicle, you know, actual lived experiences of friends of mine who are either caregivers, you know, Filipino caregivers, or who are trans women. Like, I know actual Filipinos who arranged, you know, green card marriages. And also, you know, I had friends who were caregivers themselves, and I got from them, for instance, the story about, you know, one of their patients like forgetting where they were when they were right at home. And so that's why there is, while it's not autobiographical, it's a true story when you think about it. And it's something that could happen and might have already happened, definitely. And I think the difference between my and Carlos Bulasan's work is that his work just feels, probably because it's already been almost 80 years since the publication, it feels a lot more monumental. There's a sprawling, expansive quality to it, although it also very much focuses on his intellectual life, as a writer and as an artist. And Lingua Franca feels modest and feels small only because it is about a very particular woman and her very particular struggle. But I think it's for that reason that it feels all the bigger and something that resonates more universally, with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like the individual story is always so powerful to speak to some larger questions, right? So when you were talking, one last thing about Bulasan, my husband actually pointed out that another commonality is that he was subject to state surveillance. There are FBI files on him you can find, right? And the state surveillance obviously is very prominent in your film as well. But I actually wanted to, so kind of thinking about the women that, Olivia is one story, but, that is common to a cohort of women, right? So two objects really, or symbols in the film really stood out to me, and I wanted to talk to you about them. And that was the passport and the phones, okay? And I think both of those objects do a lot of symbolic work, right? So maybe first the passport, that really jumped out to me. And I was talking to my friend Christine Peralta, who I think you talked to the other night, and we talked about how sometimes this term undocumented, isn't the most accurate, in the sense that there are plenty of documents and papers. Some of them are just the wrong kind, right, or fraudulent. And to me, the passport itself is just the symbol of power, I guess, in the story, especially that scene at the end, right, when Alex is literally holding on to Olivia's passport, right? And then I'll just say the phone part, and then I'll hand back to you. And then for me, the phones were really striking because, Olivia is literally like a lifeline to both her family in the Philippines, her mother, who constantly calls her and where's my remittances, and then Olga, who literally cannot function without Olivia, to the point where she has to call her when she's in the downstairs doing laundry, right? And so that really it just felt very emotional to me, in the sense that, there's just these decades of women, especially from going abroad around the world, and really holding up their families, holding up the Philippine economy with their remittances, right? 10% of the Philippines citizens work and live abroad, right? And then they send money home, and it's a big part of their economy. So could you talk a bit about those two symbols in particular?
What's funny is that those phone calls between Olivia and her mother, I feel like they're lifted verbatim from my own phone calls to my mom in the Philippines. And because I also do send my mom money back home, every month. So I'm just like every other OFW in that sense, or overseas Filipinx worker in that sense. And there's just, I think, a haunting power to me on film when you hear someone's voice, but not necessarily see the image. It makes you latch on that combination of mystery, because you're not seeing, the image, and intimacy, because you're hearing this voice talk about very personal things. Him attaches you to the person behind it. And that was also the the reason why, for instance, I did the opening closing montages just in voiceover. And it's also very interesting, like you pointed out, that though the phone calls happen between Olivia happen with two women who she is connected with, either in some sense spiritually. Olga is a mirror character in that they're both immigrant women that migrated to the US at different points in their lives, but also as family, like with her mother. And I wanted to also show scenes of women just being with each other and talking to each other about a subject other than men, for instance. And kind of showing and revealing that much about their interior lives and their relationships just with other women is affirming, and I feel like an assertion of their identity and personhood as individuals and as women. Yeah. And the passport, it does carry a sort of metaphorical significance in the film as the symbol of her identity and agency. And that's why, you know, in the in the dramatic climax, she asks for it back. It's, you know, unfair and really unreasonable that someone like Olivia would invest so much emotionally in a piece of paper like a passport, but for an undocumented immigrant like her, that's, I feel like, the one shred of physical material that proves that she exists, you know, that she has an identity. And when she gets it back from Alex at the end of the film, she's also gaining back her ability to decide her own fate and her own future. And although, you know, to the eyes of an outsider, her decision might seem counterintuitive or impractical, being an immigrant without papers, what's important to her is that she, you know, gains back her agency and ability to decide for her own self, even though her future, immigration-wise, remains uncertain.
Right. I mean, it's this moment of like kind of power and dignity on her terms.
Exactly.
Right? It's very suspenseful. You just don't. Is she going to do it? Is she not going to do it? And you know, and then we find out in that last scene what she decides. So I did think of one more sort of object in the film, and I thought we could talk a little bit about that before we move to questions. And that is the balikbayan box. You know. And maybe you can tell for our audience who doesn't. So what I thought was, you know, there's a scene where you can see Olivia's packing items to send home to her family in the Philippines, and that's very common practice. In fact, I Googled this. There's an Indiana, balikbayan.com company in Indianapolis, okay? Filipinos are everywhere. And I thought that was an interesting contrast to how materially spare her life is. You know, we kind of get a sense of who she is in her bedroom, but what all we see is really a sewing machine, photo album, a book, and a, you know, pleasure object. Yeah, and not, you know, she doesn't have a lot of stuff. So I thought maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about you know, literally the props in the film, but like what they, again, the symbolic weight that they carry.
Certainly. You know, it's not an exaggeration to say that for, you know, a certain group of Filipina women that come to the US, they most likely will have already had a family that they left behind in the Philippines, you know, a spouse and partner and children. And ultimately the reason that they come here is to, you know, work and send money back home. to send their kids to school, for instance, or to, build a house for the family. And so there's really a great level of self-abnegation and sacrifice involved in, it's not uncommon to hear some Filipina workers who say that, they're just living and working in the US primarily for their family back home. And so they don't have a lot of material possessions themselves or savings for that matter. A lot of it and a good chunk of the money that they make gets sent back to the Philippines and also to buy gifts and presents that they pack in this balikbayan box. And this could include, clothes, accessories like bags or shoes, shampoo, like grocery stuff that you send back home. I mean, it depends how often people send them, but it's a gesture, showing care and affection and kinship, with your family. And I'm not sure if it's just distinctly Filipino, but that certainly has become a custom for immigrants from the Philippines who have moved to other countries that are considered more prosperous, even though they themselves are working, really low paying and blue collar jobs.
So, Isabel, do you read much Asian American studies, Filipino American studies scholarship? Because your film reminds me so much of the work of scholars like Rosel Pereñas or Robin Rodriguez, Kathy Choi, Jan Petios, our own Christine Peralta. For example, Rosel Pereñas talks about what she calls the international transfer of caretaking, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is the women coming to places like the US, but other places, the Middle East and Asia and Europe. And then sometimes poor women have to move to their households to take care of their children while the migrant women leave the country. Do you read much of that work?
Yeah, definitely, especially for Filipino women that go to Hong Kong, for instance, and sometimes they get maltreated, they're not, really respected for the work that they do there, and they send them back home and they have relatives come and take care after their own young ones. So it's sad and unfortunate, but that's how life can get in the Philippines. And especially I think during this pandemic, where a lot of Filipinos have been left without employment and the government is not really doing its job to look after its citizens.
I mean, I hope if anything productive comes out of COVID and the pandemic, it's that hopefully as humanity, as the world, that we can place more value on caregiving, right? And I think that's that work, the importance of that work comes across so clearly in your film.
Yeah.
So now I think we can pivot and take some questions from the audience, and I'd love to hear what all of you would like to ask Isabel.
It's a great conversation. We have been receiving some good questions, but there is still time. So if you want to submit a question for Isabel or Ellen, just use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Ava asks, on Tuesday, Isabel spoke about the adage of filmmakers remaking the same film over and over again, which you echoed again today. Clearly a meaningful quote for you. With Lingua Franca being so autobiographical, where do you go next? What does the story become?
So my next feature, Tropical Gothic, is set in the 16th century in the Philippines. It is about a native priestess or babaylan. So it's set in the 16th century Philippines in 1570 specifically, which is, during the early years of the Spanish colonial regime there. And it's about a native priestess / babaylan, that's the native term, who pretends to be possessed by the ghost of the dead bride of her Spanish master. in order to avoid persecution as a witch. And I've described it as a vampire film without vampires. And I've actually, shared the script with some people that I respect, and they said that it reminds them of The Piano by Jane Campion. But again, it's about a woman with a secret and a woman who's attempting to gain back for herself, a certain degree of power and agency at a time when people like her are being actively oppressed and persecuted. And, since you mentioned that Lingua Franca is a very personal film and where they're going next, I think what I'm going to do primarily with a material like Tropical Gothic is really focus on aesthetic and formal experimentation. Very briefly, I'm exploring using elements and techniques in horror or atmospheric horror genre in order to make a film that is actually swooningly and overwhelmingly romantic. So I'm using horror to tell a love story, essentially, which I don't think has been done quite a lot before. And it's a move, an artistic experimentation that is risky because I could try things that ultimately will not work and will just fall flat. But that is what excites me about creating in the filmmaking process. And that's how I feel like I could continue to grow and evolve as an artist and as a filmmaker.
That's a great segue into our next question, knowing how many hats you wear and how many you'd like to explore to wear. Anonymous question, what part of the filmmaking process is your favorite? Writing and setting up during pre-production, collaborating on set, or seeing it all come together in the editing room?
I like to tell people that I'm an editor who writes, directs, and acts sometimes in my own work. And it's because I feel like when I conceive of a film, they don't come to me as words on a page or on a screenplay. They come to me visually as scenes that I'm cutting together to form, a narrative. And I feel like the reason why I do all those other things like write and direct is because they give me exactly the raw material that I want in order to cut the film that I want to make eventually. I feel like in the editing room is where the film technically actually gets made and created. And like the editor to me feels like a god who will decide, which direction the story can go. And so yeah, that's my favorite part of the filmmaking process. And what I can say for myself though is that, and I've had pushback from some producers who were not familiar with my work yet, but what I can say for myself is that I actually can be objective and impartial about my own work. I got into a few arguments with my cinematographer for Lingua Franca because we had shot an entire subplot for Olga's character and a different, beginning and ending. But as I'm cutting them together, they did not ultimately work for me, or they did not give me the emotional experience that I was hoping to create with the film. And so I told him, listen, these scenes look gorgeous, but they don't work for the story that I ultimately want to tell. So we're going to have to cut them out. So yeah.
Maybe outtakes for the Blu-ray release.
Yeah.
Well, I love that you talk about stories that you love focusing on women who have a secret. And in your answer, I'm thinking a lot of people think the director truly has the power, but really we know the editor does. So there's another woman with a secret. You have the secret power. Marie asks a very simple question. Has your mother seen your films?
No, not Lingua Franca. gosh,
Will she?
I would have a heart attack. I guess I'm gonna have two. We're both adults. Her and I. But I think I'm more nervous about her seeing the phone calls between Olivia and her mom because they're literally like lifted verbatim from my own conversations with my mom. I feel like I should give her writing credit for it, but
I wondered that too, you know, because I mean, I'm not Filipino, but at least for me in my experience, Asian families seem a little squeamish about like sex, what my mom called sex stuff.
yeah.
And I read somewhere that the first scene that you shot was the sex scene.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit? That's such an interesting choice.
Yeah. So I wanted to impress people, like, oh, because I had it in my mind that I'm working with, you know, some members in the crew are guys and are white and cisgender, and maybe like, can this person pull it off actually, like wearing all these multiple hats? So I had this idea that, you know what, I'm gonna get the sex scene out of the way, you know, early on during the production. So I said, we're gonna shoot the sex scene the first night, you know, the very first day of the shoot.
Just clear the air, get it out, get it over with, and move on. Yeah.
But it was quite nerve-wracking actually, because I've never done a scene like that before. It's not like I don't do sex scenes like every other week. Like this is literally my first sex scene in a movie, whether before transition or after transition. But I think I also made it in a way that it's really showcases the trans female gaze in portraying sensuality, and that this is not just, you know, shots cut together of naked bodies gyrating against each other, and there's definitely a kind of fixation or fascination over the trans body. So I avoided that and instead focused on her face and lingered on her face as we see this woman allowing herself to experience, you know, sexual pleasure, but also slowly becoming aware of what she's getting herself into, you know, being intimate with a man who is initially not aware that she's transgender. So in effect, I was not only making a sex scene, but a character moment for Olivia that gives her depth and complexity.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I'm going to ask one of those last questions. Ellen, if you want to think of maybe one last question before we wrap up. As I said in my introduction, I came to know your work through filmmaker Ash Mayfair. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you and Ash met, and how I see a lot of similarities in the visuals of some of your work and certainly the stories you explore surrounding women. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
You know, what's interesting is that actually I have never met Ash before she even recommended my work to you. So I'm very, very appreciative and grateful to her. I reached out to her afterwards, and we actually had dinner in New York. I think in December, just to get to know each other. And before she flew to LA for the Independent Spirit Awards. But yeah, I think it's about women who are trying to find their place and their identity. And
that's great. Well, I love, you know, ships passing in the night as we were in Palm Springs. And hopefully one day we'll get to actually meet and have dinner together too. Ellen, we have one last question from the audience. If you didn't have a last.
I'll defer to the audience question.
Okay, great. Oh, we actually got another one come in. So we'll have two last questions. In Isabel's recent Vulture interview, she referred to wanting to do an inversion of the Hitchcockian male gaze of Vertigo. In a perfect world where filmmaking is uninhibited by producers and external barriers, what does a female gaze psycho thriller look like?
I think not just psycho thriller, but I think the cinematic gaze is about desire, specifically, you know, sexual and erotic desire, the ability to appreciate beauty of the physical form, say for a heterosexual woman, for instance, the physical form and beauty of a man, and for a homosexual woman for another woman. And it's just, I think that difference between that two is that the male gaze can be quite reductive in that whichever becomes the object of their gaze is simply reduced to being the object of that desire. But I feel that the difference between the female gaze is that even though it's directed towards their object, the object still retains its own personhood and subjectivity. And that's what I also try to do with lingua franca, for instance. So in Tropical Gothic, which is what I'm trying to do, it starts out by, you know, the native priestess being the object of the male gaze, and as she's pretending, you know, to be possessed by the dead bride, she becomes the observer and the active gazer, so to speak. So anyway, it's like a hall of mirrors in that they're kind of looking at each other in ways that the other person is unaware of.
Well, that kind of answers part of the last question, which was, can we know any details about the script you've completed over the summer? But then the second part of that was, did the shutdown, the COVID shutdown, impact the material at all? Did it have any effect, not just on your process, but on the actual final product?
I think not directly with the pandemic itself, but when I left New York City to come to North Carolina, where it's a lot more quiet, and I have more solitary time, I was really just able to focus and get the story together and it in the right, you know, shape where I feel like it's ready to be shared to other people.
And I think you spoke about this on Tuesday night, maybe, but when are you thinking of hoping to start filming?
I hope to start filming next summer. We've already shared the script with some pretty high-profile potential production company partners, and some of them have expressed interest. And I'm just excited that I'm getting a project like this made that's defiantly Filipino. It's rooted in Philippine history, and it tackles colonialism and imperialism, and I'm getting it looked at in Hollywood. So, so I feel like a little double agent.
Good. Ellen or Isabel, any final comments before we wrap for the night?
Well,
Oh yes, Ellen.
so this is kind of a silly question. The last question, which is, can you imagine doing like a superhero movie or like a comedy or, you know, something totally opposite of the things that you have been making?
Yes. So two things. I'm thinking of remaking a Japanese samurai classic from the early 2000s, and I'm going to play the samurai, although the original was played by a man. And I'm going to have Keanu Reeves be my mentor.
Love it already.
And I also want to do an actual vampire movie set in 1940s Hollywood. So
we will show both of those at IU Cinema, guaranteed.
In person, I'll be there in person.
Yes, yes. Did you have a closing remarks or anything, Isabel?
I just wanted to, you know, share the most important thing that I learned as a storyteller and as a filmmaker, having made my 3 films. Mm-hmm. And it's that at the end of the day, people are not going to remember the plot points of your film or the characters and their quirks, but they're never going to forget how your film made them feel. Mm-hmm. Cinema is, at the end of the day, an emotional experience. You're taking your audience through an emotional journey. And, you know, after finishing Lingua Franca, that's become my guide in the stories that I want to tell. Like, what is my intended emotional destination for the audience? Mm-hmm. And what makes art and what makes film special and powerful is how unique and distinctive and singular that emotional experience you're creating in the viewer is. So that's something that I just wanted to share, which is the most valuable thing that I learned as a storyteller so far.
Well, and your works are all very distinct, and we thank you for allowing us to share them with our audiences.
Thank you. And I wanted to thank Britany. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor and a pleasure and a delight to be here virtually to the Indiana University Cinema, the Jorgensen Guest Filmmaker Fund, and the Asian American Studies Department as well, and to Alan for this lovely and wonderful conversation tonight.
Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you both, and thank you all at home for your thoughtful questions. I'd like to also thank the entire IU Cinema team, especially Elena, Jessica, David, Seth, Mary, Will, and Ava, who've all worked behind the scenes to make tonight's event possible. Up next in our virtual screening room is the second film in the Themester 2020 Democracy Series, the 1954 animated interpretation of George Orwell's classic novella, Animal Farm. The film is screening now through September 23rd, but please note only those registered for our live virtual introduction of the film on September 22nd will have access to watch. To all of you who tuned in tonight, thank you once again for being with us. Please take care of yourselves and be kind and generous to others, and have a very good night.